I think we really need to be honest with ourselves about something. Sometimes it's just good to be bad. Hey there, folks. I have not done a particularly pointed examination of transgender representation in media in a little while. So I want to zero in on something that I hadn't really thought about because honestly, it's not something that comes up as much as you might think. However, I saw it come up in my comment section on a recent Doctor Who video that I did, and it made me want to think and talk about it. Let's talk about, is it okay to have a transgender character be the villain of something? Yes, it is. Video over. Okay, no. Nuance. Let's add nuance to this. The reason this came up is in my review for the Doctor Who episode The Devil's Cord, I got a few, not a lot. I don't want to make this seem like, "Oh, it's a big thing." But I got a few people expressing their discomfort at the villain character of Maestro, played by Jinx Monsoon, who is a non-binary person, also a drag performer, and the character of Maestro was very much channeling Jinx's drag persona and performance style. So we have an actor who's trans. A reminder, trans is an umbrella term. So while it does obviously include trans men, people who were assigned female at birth transitioned into living as a man, and trans women, people assigned male at birth transitioned to living as a woman, it also includes basically anything that isn't cisgender. Cisgender being identifying with the gender that you were assigned at birth. So non-binary, agender, demigender, gender fluid, that's me, hi. All those things do fall under the trans umbrella, even if they don't generally use that as the preferred term to describe themselves. So in the context of this conversation that I'm having, when I say trans, I mean the whole umbrella. So coming back to Maestro, we had a non-binary performer playing a also non-binary character and who is decidedly the villain. And that made a few people, at least in my comment section, a little bit uncomfortable and asking whether that is something that should be going on right now at a time when trans people are under attack, frankly. I mean, if you don't believe or understand that, I'm not sure why you're watching and have gotten this far in the video. You probably just would have left a nasty comment in the first 5 seconds and then bailed. But, you know, unless you believe that that is somehow a good thing, and some people do, I think it's hard to deny there is a very large amount of legislature and restriction of rights and access to healthcare going on in places like the UK and the US towards trans people. That is just factually a thing that is happening. So the question, or I guess the concern from some of these commenters was, is this a time to be having a trans person as a villain? Is that okay when we are being demonized so much by so many things, be they politicians, be they legislators, be they celebrities, be they online pundits, be they child series authors? We've got enough. Should we have a clearly, visibly trans person be a villain in a mainstream thing? And the short answer, as I said, is that's fine. The long answer is it depends on context, because there's a lot of layers to context. There's the narrative context within the piece of work itself, but there's also, and this was more the thing that people were bringing up, the cultural context of what's going on in general in the world. Both are relevant. I am admittedly going to focus a little bit more on the narrative context because whether or not it's appropriate in the cultural context gets a little bit more in the weeds on sort of personal feelings and where you think lines should be drawn when things cross over into the real world. And while I'm not going to say I don't have an opinion on that, I am going to say that I know that it's just a messier discussion. But I will be touching on real world context as we go. It's just not going to be my main focus, but I have to acknowledge it. If I pretend that the only context is the context in the piece of work, in the piece of media, in the story, then I have left out a huge chunk. So I'm definitely not doing that. But there's a couple of things to take into account. One, I get it. I get the anxiety. And whenever I find out that a trans person or character or performer is being a villain in something, there is part of me that's like, I don't know about that. And I try very much not to judge in advance, but, we got to get some context on that. But also, can we just be blunt about something? Playing the villain is a lot of fun. I say this as a performer. I got to voice a Sith Inquisitor in Jesse Gender's extremely long and very good video on the Star Wars monomyth, and I had an absolute blast doing that.
Well-told story, but it's just that, a story.
I would love to play more villains. I adore playing villains. It's so much fun. And I guess my initial thought is like, I don't think that restricting the options of what the few trans actors who are actually getting work are allowed to do is helpful. Is it helpful to try and help a group by restricting members of that group? That's already kind of dicey. But more than that, I think the major overriding thing for me in most contexts is, okay, does their transness factor into their villainy at all? And the thing is, I don't have as many examples to cite on this as you might think I do, because believe it or not, at this point in time, despite all the demonization in mainstream entertainment, at least, trans villains are not as prevalent as they once were. There was kind of a surge of them in film and especially television, starting in the 90s, going through, I'd say, the 2000s into maybe the 2010s. Back in the early 2010s, GLAAD actually published some findings on a decade worth of appearances of trans characters. By and large, when they appeared, it was as one-off characters in stuff like CSI and Law and Order. And about 35% of the time, they were victims, and about 21% of the time, they were killers. That is not great. That's just not great. But that is sort of the reality of what it was in TV, at least for a while. As for movies, there's certainly infamous examples, Silence of the Lambs and Ace Ventura kind of being the big ones. And before people get into me on this and start arguing with me about Silence of the Lambs, going on about how, but the film specifically says...
There's no correlation in the literature between transsexualism and violence. Transsexuals are very passive.
Billy is not a real transsexual. But he thinks he is. He tries to be.
Okay, that doesn't matter because other than people trying to argue that point, nobody remembers that. What they remember is what he does. And what he does is put on makeup, take the skin of his victims, who are all women, and make a suit because he wants to be a woman. Regardless of what words are said within that film, that like, oh no, he's not actually transgender, and everything about that codes onto a belief that at least the character thinks he is, and that is a problem regardless. Buffalo Bill is, at this point, I don't think it was intended as being harmful to the trans community, but boy is it. Boy has it been. Boy has it been persistent. The number of times I've seen anything or anybody parody either specifically the "would you me? I'd me" moment, or just in general give that voice, very clearly doing the Buffalo Bill voice to a character that is meant to be trans or even just a gay woman. Sometimes they do that, but they just want to code her masculinely, usually while being voiced by a man.
Does anybody need Wi-Fi? Because I'm making a hotspot.
Regardless, I got to move off that tangent. But trans villains, at least in film, are not so much a thing at this point. That hasn't shown up, at least in mainstream film, in a fair amount of time. So talking about this in general is honestly a lot more philosophical, conceptual, and less about the concreteness of what has actually gone on. I will be talking about the Doctor Who villain of Maestro, but that is probably the primary example I'm going to cite because most other things that I can think of are old, to the point of Whether or not they're representative of what may or may not be happening out there right now, it's hard for me to say. And unfortunately, while I did find that research published by GLAAD, that was published back in the early 2010s, and while it was a decade worth of research and it was helpful, it didn't, if they've done something newer that is equivalent of like what it was like the decade following that, which would have brought us to just a couple years ago, I couldn't find it. But talking broadly, the main thing for me will always be, is their villainy specifically linked to their transness or their transcoding? In the case of a character like Buffalo Bill, who is not explicitly described as trans and in fact is explicitly described as being not trans, but he's still coded as hell as one. Because I would say that generally when you're talking about any oppressed group, it's not inherently a problem to make them a villain. The problem is to make the specifics of their minority status deeply tied into their villainy. I'm not going to say there's no way to do that and have it work, but it's incredibly difficult, and that's usually a red flag. So to look back at films like Dressed to Kill, which had Michael Caine dressing as a woman to be able to get close to and murder women. In that case, basically cross-dressing is deeply tied into the villainy. Buffalo Bill, obviously, already brought it up. Ace Ventura, the villain on that, boy, is it debatable what the hell's going on with there and how sincerely that character is even trans. But is the transness linked to the villainy? Yes, it's how the villain is getting close to the people that the villain is hoping to kill. So yeah, no, pretty directly tied into it. But let's look at a character like Maestro. What the character is doing, if you didn't see the episode, is basically consuming music, taking music out of the world and leaving it to rot as people lose their sense of fun and joy and hope and connection in the absence of music. And while it is, again, very much a drag performance, that as a villainous MO, that's not tied to being trans or even being a drag queen. Now, for comparison, for everything going on right now, because while drag queens are not necessarily trans, again, Jinx is, but while not all drag queens are trans, in fact, a very large percentage of them are not, there is still a lot of attacks against trans people that get tied in and mixed up with attacks against drag queens. You can look at all the controversies around things like Drag Story Hour to see how this stuff all gets jumbled together and we all get thrown under the bus in a very, very similar way by the same people. So I would still link those together, even though being a drag queen is not the same thing as being trans. I know that. Hopefully you know that. But boy, the people who hate folks like me, they either don't know that or they want to ignore that. But given how drag the character is, like the Maestro is just very drag. They just are. What would have been a bit more of a problem would be if the character, instead of being Maestro, was something like storyteller and who told stories, like read picture books to children in order to lure them in and do nefarious things. That would be a problem, because that lie about the idea of trans people or drag queens being groomers and using things like Trans Story Hour to get to our children, if you made a villain that fed directly into that fear, yeah, that's going to be a problem, because you are reinforcing the stuff that is used to harm us in the real world. Just having a trans or drag or kind of both character just be the villain is not necessarily reinforcing the negative things that are said and believed and pushed about us. There is another factor, especially in something like Doctor Who, because Doctor Who has something that I would ask of most things that are going to try and make, honestly, any minority or oppressed group one of the villains, which is provide counterexamples. Have other members of that same othered or oppressed group who are not villains. Now, you still have to balance this correctly and not have them be like token and like they're just there like, oh, see, here's some good ones. Now to the villain. Like, no, that doesn't work. But Doctor Who, in its last few episodes, has had multiple positive examples of trans characters. We had Rose Noble in the special The Star Beast, and she also featured in The Giggle. And then in Church on Ruby Road, we had the Doctor's companion, Ruby, is in a band, and one of the band members is a trans woman. And they're happy, good friend, casual, positive. So when you are presenting me a trans villain and you've already given me two positive depictions of trans characters, I think both of which are have been hinted at returning to appear again, so they're not just one-offs, whereas Maestro likely is, yeah, that also balances it quite a bit. Because nobody can point to you and say, the only trans representation you're having is the bad guy. Well, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. So that sure helps. In general, with depiction of any group, tying what makes them othered into their villainy is dicey. I talked about this in some more detail in a video I did a few years ago, talking about depictions of disabled characters. And I had a segment in that talking about villains with visible disabilities, which, boy, there are a lot. Now, a lot of them just kind of lean into the idea of like a visual disfigurement, scar, whatever, is just used as villain coded. Like, that's a problem in and of itself. But at least to me, I feel, and I say this as a non-disabled person, but I can't help but feel that it's more damaging when the disability specifically feeds into the villainy or is even the cause of the villainy. Because you can definitely come up with characters, and I named some in that video if you want to go and get some specific examples. I don't want to drag this out too long since I already talked about it. But you can definitely find examples of villains whose villainy is in some way directly tied into their disability, that they went mad or trying to compensate for some disability they have. Their disability made them bitter and angry at the world, and they're lashing out. I'm like, that... So that's kind of a problem. And to circle back to real world context, like, real world context does still matter. The fact that trans people or any oppressed group is being just lambasted in the real world, putting us up as the villains is, I'm not going to say that there's no issue with that, but with trans people specifically, I'm still going to single out the much bigger issue being when you cast cisgender people to play us. That, at this point in time at least, is inherently damaging, regardless of any of the specifics of the narrative that you're doing, because it reinforces something that is used actively to oppress us in the real world, which is the idea that trans people are really cisgender people who are just pretending. And when you cast an actor, especially if you cast a cisgender actor whose identity in real life is the gender that the character transitioned out of, i.e. a cis man playing a trans woman, no matter what is in the narrative, that casting alone still reinforces the notion that trans women are really just men in makeup who are pretending. And it reinforces that because that's what the actor you cast is. And that narrative is specifically being wielded to harm us. And right now, at this point in time, it is harmful. And I would say you should not be doing that at all. Will that ever change? Maybe one day when there isn't a ton of legislature and laws and all this other stuff wielding that idea, that false idea against us. Maybe sometime in the future, yeah. Maybe it'll be fine to cast a cisgender person as a trans character. Not right now, though. And while some people may make the determination that because trans people are going through all this nonsense at all, that's enough to be like, don't make a trans villain. I'm not prepared to go there. Because, again, coming back to what I said at the start, I don't think restricting the opportunities of actual trans people, be they writer, directors, or actors, just because it doesn't fit the current messaging is helpful. Is it possible for a trans person in the role of a trans villain to shape a character or be in a story where it actually does hurt things and make things worse? Yeah, it's definitely possible, but it's not automatic. And so I am far from the first person to point out only good representation is boring. It is. It's boring. And I don't think there is any issue with having a trans villain in concept. What's going to make and break you are the specifics. Because nuance is a thing, and nothing is ever always. At most, things are, it's definitely this for now, which is kind of my position with the casting cis actors thing. I just had this in my mind, rattling around after seeing those comments, and wanted to get it out there. What do you think about all this? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills, enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, subscribe also are of great assistance, and there's links to other things I do down in the description. Don't worry too much about it, though. Because what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful. You are valid. You are loved. You are the council, and I am just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Now to give my thanks to my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Badasalida, Oliver B., Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Jean Foray, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Melinda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Bernabe Likes the Poodle, Tracy Scrappett, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, White Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Toka Blahuvian, Pau Barabajagal, and Mara G. Thank you so much for your support. You can get your name said, maybe even correctly, in the Patreon support tiers. Also, it helps me feed these little buggers.